Hello and welcome to the Westminster Institute. I'm Robert Riley, its director. Today we're very pleased to welcome back to the Westminster Institute our guest Clyde Prestowitz, who's very well known for his trade experience and expertise. Clyde is the founder and president of Economic Strategy Institute. He is a veteran U.S. trade negotiator and presidential advisor to Presidents Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama. He has worked on Asia and globalization for more than 50 years. He was a leader of the first U.S. trade mission to China in 1982 and helped to arrive at agreements that enabled U.S. companies to establish operations in China. Clyde is the author of many books, including Rogue Nation, 3 billion new capitalists, the great shift of wealth and power to the East, the betrayal of American prosperity, and Japan Restored. His most recent book is The World Turned Upside Down, America, China, and the Struggle for Global Leadership. Mr. Prestowitz has a BA with honors from Swarthmore College and an MA in East-West Policies and Economics from the East-West Center of the University of Hawaii, and an MBA from the Wharton Graduate School of Business. He also studied at Keio University in Tokyo. Clyde is fluent in Japanese, Dutch, German, and French. He is joining us today to discuss navigating the coming trade wars. Clyde, thank you very much for coming. Let me begin with a provocative quote from President Trump.
Okay.
Though many of them are. Okay, he said, tariffs are going to make us rich as hell. It's going to bring our country's businesses back. Is that a realistic expectation?
Well, interestingly, despite much of the nonsense that Trump spouts, there's a grain of truth in that one. We have really since World War II worshipped at the temple of free trade, but over the last, well, since that time, but particularly over the last, let's say, 30 years since the 1990s, the assumptions that we have made about trade and the players in the international marketplace are increasingly wrong. Particularly, we tried and assumed that if we were nice to China and if we tried to bring China into the free trade sphere, that China would become, more and more a free market and a market player. That that hasn't happened. Our assumptions were wrong, and we should have known that they were wrong because we had had experience with other countries along the same lines. So, ironically, I mean, I don't think Trump has thought this thing of tariffs through very carefully. And I would be very careful about how and when he does it. But it's not a crazy idea.
He made another interesting remark that, and I'm quoting him, instead of taxing our citizens to enrich other countries, we will tariff and tax foreign countries to enrich our citizens, unquote.
Yeah.
But
Well,
that, I mean, the tariffs are paid by American citizens, not foreign ones. So how would that enrich?
well, the tariffs are it depends very much on how you do it, of course. But tariffs are a barrier to the sales of foreign products in the U.S. market. So the foreigners are selling us less, and that suggests then that we're making more of what we consume. And now you can argue whether that's beneficial or not. And it is under certain circumstances, and it's not under circumstances. So you have to be careful about how the circumstances. But let's, to put things in very concrete order, America got rich with tariffs. Abraham Lincoln, in the middle of the Civil War, raised tariffs on steel. all the economists at that time cried and moaned that Lincoln didn't know what he was doing. But Lincoln said, well, he said, if we, if I have tariff, if I don't have any tariffs, I buy steel from England and you know, and I get steel. But if I have tariffs, he said, I get the steel and I also get the money. So America got rich behind tariffs. Germany got rich behind tariffs. Japan got rich behind tariffs. No country that has gotten rich has done so except oil producing countries without tariffs. So the free trade doctrine that we've adopted in the post World War II era has a lot of flaws and inaccuracies. And so, what Trump is talking about, tariffs is not necessarily a problem, but it very much depends on who and how you do it.
Well, what do you think about what he said about who he is going to impose these tariffs on, particularly Mexico and Canada, which
Yeah,
together are.
that's a very good point. Mexico and Canada are actually the last people to on whom we ought to impose tariffs. Uh, we don't have trade problems with Mexico and Canada. Um, the industries of Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. are so intimately tied together that it's almost like putting tariffs on ourselves. I mean, we make General Motors makes cars in Canada and ships them across the border to the U.S. market. So we're going to put tariffs on General Motors. I don't think they've thought that through very carefully. But I think, on the other hand, countries like China, for example, I can think of some others, but particularly China. Uh, in effect, China is putting tariffs on us. And so there are many places where we could respond in form. Uh,
Clyde, what do you mean by that? That China is putting tariffs on us?
let's take uh, what China does. China for a long time was making uh, panels, electric panels. When China began to make panels, uh, it was a high cost producer. And we did not impose tariffs. Germany was the low cost producer at the time. Um, China put up tariffs on it didn't import any panels from China, Germany, or from us. We in Germany were the low cost producers. China put on tariffs, and it began to produce panels. It has a very large market, and as it produced panels, its costs fell. So today, China is the low cost producer of panels, but it got there by putting on tariffs. And that's just one example. There are many other markets in which China has effectively done the same thing. Also, we speak about tariffs, but China is very generous in the subsidies and other economic or financial incentives that it provides to the market, to its producers, which is effectively a tariff. We don't call it a tariff, but subsidies are a kind of tariff. And so I think in the case of China-US economic relationships, there's a lot more that we ought to be thinking about in terms of tariffs or other mechanisms. Uh,
Well, President Trump mentioned uh, putting a 10% across the board tariff on China, I think on 1 February. Is that an effective response?
it would not be a terrible move. Actually, I think about a 20% tariff would be effective. Um, and I think that we have to we have to really rethink. In the case of China, we're not dealing with a country like even Germany or France. It's not a truly market economy. Um, it uses market forces in some ways, but it heavily subsidizes. It provides. Uh, I mean, even the workforce is is controlled where it lives. It's just not a comparable economy. And China is, I think, certainly aiming to overtake the United States in most of the high-tech areas. I mean, it has said made in China by 2025. That was the slogan that was manufactured back in 2015. Uh, and if you look at where China was in 2015 and where they are today, it's making a lot more of things in China. So they kind of accomplished the mission. Uh, so I think there's a lot that can and should be done vis-a-vis China. Now, Trump talking about putting tariffs on Canada and Mexico is, it's kind of, I mean, it's nonsense, basically.
And also the EU.
Yeah, the EU is a little bit different, but essentially it's the same as Mexico and Canada. We don't have any real uh, problems with the EU. I mean, yeah, there are, of course, always things to be negotiated, but the EU and we are playing essentially the same game. The EU and we are not playing the same game as China, or I mean, some of the other developing countries, India, Indonesia. They're playing a different game. Not to say it's the wrong game, but it's a different game. And therefore, we need to do, we have assumed that free trade, everybody will kind of play free trade by the rules. Well, economic development is not necessarily based on free trade. Uh, all the world's countries that are rich got rich not by free trade. And so we have to be more measured and diversified in our trade policy.
President Biden was also a critic of China's policies, and
Yeah,
he emplaced some tariffs on them. For instance, last May 14th, he imposed the following tariffs on China's steel and aluminum, 25%, 90% on semiconductors, 100% on EVs, and 50% on solar panels.
yeah.
That's since May 14th. What have the results of that been? Was that an effective thing to do?
I think it was. I mean, one result of you put all that package together. The U.S. back in the 1980s, the U.S. was the world's leading semiconductor producer. It was at the leading edge of the technology, and it produced most of the world's semiconductors. Today, we've fallen behind both in the technology, and we produce maybe 20% of the world's semiconductors. So I think that what President Biden did was positive, and in fact, interestingly, the world's leading edge semiconductor producer, TSMC in Taiwan Semiconductor Corporation, has taken the lead in the technology. Interestingly, as a result of Biden's pressure and incentives, TSMC has built a fab in Arizona. And it turns out that the Arizona fab is more productive than the fabs in Taiwan. So this, I think, is a great accomplishment of Biden's policy. And Trump ought to continue the same policy.
I wonder what price advantage Arizona would have over Taiwan in producing these. Uh,
I don't know exactly what the cost breakdown is, but the key point is that the production is more efficient apparently in Arizona than in Taiwan for that product. That's not across the board, but for the particular product they're making. I mean, you have to understand that wages are not important in semiconductors. The labor cost is almost nothing. It's capital and technology. And apparently TSMC has put good capital and good technology in Arizona.
Clyde, when President Trump gives his rationale
Hmm.
for increasing tariffs on Canada and Mexico, the reason he gives for doing that is not an economic one, it's a political one. He says, uncontrolled traffic in fentanyl
Cross-border?
coming across the U.S.
Yeah, yeah,
border.
yeah. Well, I mean, that's that's nonsense. The tariff's not going to not going to have any impact on uncontrolled cross-border crossings. Uh, and it's so funny. Um, I'm living in Reno, Nevada right now, and I have an acquaintance uh, who voted for Trump, but he has an illegal Mexican guy working for him. And the illegal Mexican has brought his wife, who's pregnant from Mexico, so that the child will be born here in the U.S. A tariff is not going to affect that.
Well, I think he wants to use the tariffs as a bludgeon to get Canada and Mexico to increase their border controls and stop the flow. Uh,
Well, maybe that's it, but I think it's a very crude weapon. There are better weapons. Trump has made a big deal out of the illegals and the crossings, but here in Nevada, I mean, if you got rid of if you immediately picked up all of the illegal Mexicans who are working here and sent them to Mexico, the Nevada economy would collapse. Large percentage of the people here are illegal, and it's true in other states. This problem we've tried to address this problem before, but in both Republican and Democratic administrations, but we haven't yet come up with a real solution. And Trump is just using clubs that are likely to be more destructive than productive.
what authority does he have to do these things?
That's a good question. I mean, Congress, of course, does make the laws. Trump can't just declare. We'll see how it works out in the Congress. The Republican majority in the Congress is very slim. It's not going to be just a matter of Trump saying, let's do this, let's do that.
How will the Customs Service respond when President Trump gives an order like that? Would they just say you don't have the authority for that, or you need congressional
Well, I'm
approval for
sure the
that?
Customs Service will respond to the extent that they can respond under the law, they will. But as you point out, the laws are made by Congress, not by the president.
Speaking of which, when the president, that is, talks about tariffs on Mexico and Canada, Congress passed the current trade agreement affecting Mexico, Canada, and the United States that received the largest bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress
Yeah.
of any trade agreement
Well,
in
exactly,
history.
exactly.
So I mean, what changes, excuse me, would he attempt to make that would gain that kind of bipartisan support?
Now, look, I have no idea what changes he has in mind, and I don't think he does either. He's, he's a demagogue. He's using Canada and Mexico as whipping boys, uh, emotionally, to appeal to the fears and the prejudices of the American public. But uh, his ability to actually do something legally is, again, you go back to the Congress. The Congress has to pass laws, and then the Supreme Court, can, if Congress passes laws that are unconstitutional, the Supreme Court will knock them down. So we have a government of mixed powers. Trump is not a king, or or a dictator, although he may like to be one, he's not.
Yes, well, which leads some to say that President Trump is using this kind of rhetoric as a negotiating tactic. That, in fact, since
It's a
he,
bad, if he is, it's a bad tactic. Uh,
why, what will the,
if I were the president of Mexico or the prime minister of Canada, what Trump has been saying would not make me feel like I wanted to sit down and talk with him, or accommodate him in some way. It would be just the opposite. I'd try to figure out how I could make life difficult for him.
well, in fact, that's what the Canadians certainly and the Mexicans are saying. They're
Yeah,
looking at how to
yeah,
retaliate.
yeah.
Um,
No, and I mean, look, Texas. The governor of Texas screams about illegals, but you know that where the cartels in Mexico get their guns, they get them from Texas. Why doesn't the governor of Texas crack down on gun sales? Uh, I mean, this is so hypocritical. This whole game of blaming Mexico when most of it's our fault.
well, it does seem to uh, threaten to disrupt some of the most productive trade relationships that the United States
Yeah, sure.
has
Yeah.
with our immediate neighbors
Yeah.
and with European countries. Um, I mean, Clyde, you know Japan like the back of your hand. Uh, we don't hear it mentioned in any of these.
No, interestingly and nicely, since it was so much of a target for so long. But we have had again, Nippon Steel made a bid to buy U.S. steel. In my view, that would have been a win-win for everybody. U.S. Steel is a sick company. Nippon Steel is really alive. Nippon Steel makes steel cheaper and better than U.S. Steel. And Nippon was, they were careful to make concessions and set the deal up in such a way that they weren't going to be hurting the workers or taking steel production out of the United States. I thought it was a brilliant idea. But the steel workers, the U.S. steel workers, didn't like it because at the moment, the U.S. steel workers have a huge influence on the corporate policies. And Nippon was going to probably make the atmosphere or the environment maybe a little bit less accommodating to labor, or labor thought that they might be. And so in my view, we missed a good opportunity to improve U.S. steel production, both in terms of quality and capacity, because the U.S. steel workers shot it down. Uh,
So, Clyde, obviously, the problem child isn't Canada or Mexico, it's China. Can you speak of how other countries, principally Japan, say, or other Southeast Asian countries, deal with the same kind of predatory practices in which China engages?
sure. Let's use Japan as an example. So Japan is a country in which the industrial structure and the industry government relationship is, quite different from the U.S. The Chinese have less ability to go into Japan and to make acquisitions or to scoop up information than they have in the United States. Then, secondly, the Japanese have invested and have production facilities in China, and they have been able to accommodate China in a lot of ways. It's much easier for the Japanese to make tacit backroom agreements both among themselves and with the Japanese and with the Chinese than it is for the U.S. The U.S. is a more by the book kind of and open, transparent to the public, and therefore it's more difficult in the U.S. to kind of make tacit agreements one way or the other.
So you think Japan gets a better trade deal than the United States?
I wouldn't say that they get a better trade deal, but they take care of themselves better. And this is where, in Japan, the cooperation between industry and government is much more sophisticated than it is in the United States. American businessmen, pound their chests and say, we don't like big government. They come running to big government when they feel that they need some help. But in Japan, government and business are working together all the time. It's much more of a well-oiled machine than in the U.S. And also, the Japanese public, think about it this way. Let's say Korea. Korea sells a lot of cars in the United States. You would think, I mean, Korea is one of the major car producers. You would think that it could sell cars in Japan. Well, there aren't any Korean cars in Japan. Why is that? Are the Japanese, do they have some kind of tariffs we don't know about? No, the Japanese don't have any tariffs on cars, no restriction on cars, but Korean cars are not sold in the Japanese market. And there are a lot of societal and
Cultural.
cultural reasons for that. But the Japanese market is just um, much more difficult to penetrate by foreigners than the U.S. market. Now, mind you, there aren't a lot of Japanese cars sold in Korea. Uh, so, but I think something to keep in mind is that these countries are all either developing countries or they're close enough to their period of development that they remember it. And they know that if you want to develop an industry domestically, it's very hard to do so if the market is completely open to foreign producers who are more advanced than you. You're trying to catch up. The Asians are just more subtle than the Americans.
Clyde, there's another issue that's received a lot of attention, and that is the size of the U.S. trade deficit, which is well over $1 trillion.
Yeah,
Is that a problem? I mean,
yeah, it's a big problem.
it's certainly presented as one. And could you describe the nature of that problem?
It's a problem in a lot of respects, both short term and long term. It arises because the dollar is overvalued. The overvaluation of the US dollar, it feels good. If you're an American and you go to London or Paris or Tokyo and the dollar buys a lot, boy, you really feel you like that. But what it means is that we are continuing to go into debt, international debt. Uh,
Why
we,
so?
well, because we are spending more than we're producing and selling. So we effectively borrow money to continue the spending. So if you look at our international debt, I mean, think about this. In 1980, we had almost no international debt. Today, it's huge. And the system, unfortunately, the international monetary system is set up such that it kind of depends on the dollar, and the dollar ultimately depends on us buying a lot of stuff, and so it's kind of a vicious circle, uh, and ultimately it's going to be unsupportable. Uh, but there are a lot of vested interests, and the interests will resist a dollar revaluation or a change in the monetary system until it's absolutely necessary.
The BRICS countries have had discussions about starting their own currency. Do you think that?
Yeah, well, the BRICS don't like to be um, they say that they don't like the dollar system because the dollar being the global currency, being the global reserve currency, they feel puts them at a disadvantage. But they don't have a real solution to that. Their own currencies are not strong and are subject to manipulation. And the countries themselves, uh, while they're striving to develop, most of them are uh, irregular in their financial dealings. So I think that they are kind of pointing to a real long-term problem, which is that the dominance of the dollar cannot last forever, but it can last for quite a long time, and we don't have a good alternative. Not only we, the United States, but we, the world, don't have a good alternative to the dollar as the reserve currency. You can't go back to gold, and so this is an issue that I would hope that the Trump administration would try to address the problem of uh, the dollar as the reserve currency and develop a more accommodative international financial system. But the the words coming out of Trump's mouth don't point in that direction.
Well, what would that look like, Clyde?
Well, um, if you go back before World War One, everybody was on a gold standard, and no national currency was dominant.
Not the British pound?
Well, I mean, the British pound was important, but gold was the standard. The Brits had to deal in gold when they did certain transactions. Or if you go back to Bretton Woods when the current system was set up, and John Maynard Keynes wanted to have Bancor, he wanted to have an international currency called Bancor, and so you know that would be an international currency, and no country would kind of dominate the financial system. Harry White, the U.S. Treasury representative at Bretton Woods, opposed that because for a lot of reasons, but primarily because the dollar was king at that time, and it had great advantages for the United States for the dollar to be king. But in the long term, Keynes was right, in my view. I think, and the IMF has struggled. They have special reserves, which is kind of a international currency, but it never became effective. And at some point, I think that the IMF is going to have to deal with a shift from the dollar to something more international than the dollar.
It seems that the advantages that obtain to the United States from having the world reserve currency are being squandered in the sense that what certainly isn't sustainable is a government spending that so far outstrips revenue that the inflation is a certainty.
Yeah. Well, for all those reasons, I mean, if you if you look at U.S. international debt, it has mushroomed, coming from practically zero in 1980 to I don't know what it is, I forget what it is today, but it's huge. So that means we owe foreigners. We're paying out to foreigners all the time, that's you can't do that indefinitely.
In the past, when some of the economic troubles the United States has, which it seems unwilling, politically unwilling to address through the necessary reforms, the response comes that, well, our economy will have to grow itself out of these problems. That, in other words, economic growth is going to
Yeah,
solve some of these
yeah.
things.
Well, but there's the problem. How can you get economic growth when you import everything that you, all the vital, or a large number of the vital products that you need? You can't get growth if you're only buying. You have to produce something and sell it, and you have to sell it in the international marketplace.
Well,
Uh,
presumably that's one of the reasons why Trump is so pro-tariff.
well, and tariffs can play an important role, but you have to have a tariff system that's designed to achieve what you want to achieve. I mean, putting tariffs on Canada and Mexico is not going to make it easier to produce in the United States. My example of General Motors. General Motors makes cars in Canada. They make them in the U.S. and they're kind of interchangeable. If you say, okay, you can't bring in cars from Canada, then what do you do for some of your critical elements? So tariffs is it's a dangerous word. It can't tariffs can be useful. I support useful imposition of tariffs, but you have to be sensitive. What is it you're trying to achieve? You want to punish somebody, or do you want to stimulate American uh, technological development, American production, and reduce the U.S. trade deficit? I think you should do the latter.
Well, the effect they seem to be having is to scare people. It scares some countries which are our allies, and it worries many that should these tariffs be used as a kind of blunderbuss, it could start a trade war, which would have the effect of reducing economic growth for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reaction is that in some ways, foreign countries benefit from the strong dollar. In other words, companies like Apple, for example, don't produce in America any longer. They produce in various places around the world. So the countries that are receiving Apple's investment to produce things, and because they're producing things, Apple's transferring technology to them, they like that. And so when you mention tariffs, they immediately say, oh God, we're going to lose this. But in the long run, if the United States is increasingly indebted, it's not going to be able to be a great market. It's not going to be able to spend on R&D to improve its own productivity. So in the long run, this is not a winning strategy. But I can understand that, you know, countries that are kind of comfortable with how things are working at the moment get scared when you talk about dramatically changing it.
Clyde, this is a closing question. Can I ask you whether you're generally an optimist in terms of the, U the U.S.
Oh,
economy? I guess that's a laugh line, right?
well, I mean, I am kind of an optimistic person, and I do think that there's a reasonable chance that these problems can be solved. But I have to say that the older I get, the less optimistic. Maybe that's just an aspect of getting old. But no, I'm really worried by the Trump policy so far. Uh,
Well, what about the appointments or the nominations he's
yeah,
made for key positions Secretary of the Treasury, U.S. Trade Rep, and that kind of thing. Does that ameliorate any of your worries or increase them? Are you familiar with some of these
No,
nominees?
I'm skeptical of a lot of the appointments, and I feel that Trump obviously likes to gather power around him, uh, and he has named as appointments. There are some good appointments. I think Rubio at State is a good appointment. Um, but there are just a number of appointments that they are puppets and not qualified for the jobs, in my view, and it bothers me. Uh,
Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time, and I would like to thank our guest, Clyde Prestowitz, who's the president of the Economic Strategy Institute, for joining me today to discuss the issue of uh, uh, tariffs and possibility of trade wars. Um, I
Good to be
thank
with you. Thank you.
thank you, Clyde, and I invite our viewers to go to the Westminster Institute website, where you'll find a number of other programs that we have recorded and for which we have transcripts, including one from a couple of years ago with our guest today, with Clyde. So we hope you'll take a look at the riches we have on offer there. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Robert Riley.